Okay, everybody, welcome and Shabbat Shalom. Just a word of Torah before we continue with the service. This week's Torah portion is a double portion. It's called Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. The two sections are together. Acharei Mot includes some of the passages that we read on Yom Kippur. And one of the chapters, this is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, contains one of the verses that is perhaps one of the most controversial in the entire Bible, one that I believe has been misunderstood. And I want to try to clear up some of that confusion, at least from my perspective. At least I hope I can offer some insight. I'm referring to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see what I'm talking about. I've prepared a few sources so that we can understand this verse. So Leviticus 18:22 is the commandment that says, "Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman." It is, in Hebrew, a to'eva, which translated means an abomination or an abhorrence. At least we think that's what it means. So based on this one verse, many in our world think that a homosexual relationship, or by extension, a lesbian relationship, a loving relationship between two men or two women, is forbidden by the Torah. On the surface, it would seem that that's what this verse is teaching us. But I want to suggest a different possibility that at least deserves our consideration. The Bible describes the relationship between David, and this is before he was king and then during his kingship, a loving relationship that he had with Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of the first king of Israel, King Saul. And you can just read the language, and it's plain in the Bible. This is the first book of Samuel, chapter 18. It said, "When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved David as himself. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his cloak and tunic, and he gave them to David, together with his sword, his bow, and his belt." That's a lavish offering of gifts to a friend. It again just emphasizes the whole and complete love that David and Jonathan had for each other. And then source number 3 goes even further. This is once tragically both Saul and Jonathan are killed in battle. This is the opening of the second book of Samuel. And David cries out, he eulogizes them, and he says, "How have the mighty fallen in the thick of battle, Jonathan slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war perished." Now, maybe this is poetry. Maybe David is, waxing poetic when he says, "Your love to me was more dear than the love of women." But on the surface, at least, that's a very strong statement about the passion that David had for Jonathan, and of course, how much Jonathan loved David. So was this the kind of love that was, platonic? Was it the kind of love that was an intimate love of, like the love maybe between two brothers? Was it a physical kind of love and passion? We really don't know, but the Bible is making it clear that David and Jonathan, these two men, they loved each other. The Bible approves of this loving relationship between not just any two men, but men who were and would become the royalty of Israel. I think it's beautiful, and it's also striking very much in contrast, I think, with the plain meaning of this first verse from Leviticus. This next text is from one of my teachers, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, in thinking about Jewish law and homosexuality, and he wrote the following: I, for one, cannot believe that the God who created us all produced a certain percentage of us to have sexual drives that cannot be legally expressed under any circumstances. That is simply mind-boggling and, frankly, un-Jewish. And what Rabbi Dorff is saying is that, God created us in certain ways, and the science is very overwhelmingly clear that we are created. Sexuality is not a choice. We are created on a sexual spectrum, one way or the other. It's not like we're choosing to behave in certain ways. We have natural desires, natural tendencies when it comes to our sexuality. And given that, if you believe that, which the science does point in that direction, then how can we believe in a God who would have created people to be a certain way, but then forbidden them from expressing themselves as full human beings? It doesn't make sense. And that would point to a God as a kind of a cruel God. And I simply, along with Rabbi Dorff, we simply cannot believe in that kind of God. And then he goes on to make his case further in that text. And now here's another verse, the opening of Leviticus 18, that I think is very important in understanding the verse that seems to prohibit homosexual relations. God commanded us when we were still wandering in the desert, after the practices of the land of Egypt, you will not do. And after the practices of the land of Canaan, you will not do. In other words, where we were in Egypt, we will not follow those practices, and we will not do what the Canaanites do. And then after that lists a whole series of sexual prohibitions in the verses leading up to Leviticus 18:22, and the verses after that talks about not having sex with relatives, not having sex with animals, all kinds of sexual activities which God considered repugnant and things that we should not do. They are not examples of, holy, loving sexual relationships, at least as far as the Torah is concerned. So, understood in that context, Leviticus 18:22 perhaps is not referring to just any homosexual relationship between two men. It's referring to certain kinds of sexual relationships that were practiced in Egypt and in Canaan that were considered, repugnant and out of bounds. There might have been a power dynamic involved, maybe some kind of abusive relationship. It's been interpreted in many different ways, but I don't think the Torah is referring to a loving, respectful relationship between two individuals when in Leviticus 18:22. Here's one more text, and this is from Rabbi Neil Joseph Levinger, who's one of my colleagues. What seems clear to me is that this text in Leviticus could not have been prohibiting long-term, loving, open, committed relationships between people of the same genders, because such relationships were probably inconceivable to the Torah's human editors. Instead, the Torah seems to be talking about sex in the context of non-Israelite religious practices, or abusive uses of power, or sexual contact outside established consensual relationships. In other words, the Torah is probably prohibiting the kind of sexual behaviors a contemporary Jewish ethic might posit as problematic for any religious and ethically sensitive Jew, gay or straight. By looking at both historical context and making plain our theological assumptions, one may thus find the seeds of ethical guidance and holiness of deed, even in the most difficult and controversial passage. Now, Marlborough Jewish Center, we support Keshet. Keshet is the organization that stands for LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. If you want to know more about Keshet and how to support their mission, you can go to www.keshetonline.org. So again, what I wanted to do tonight is take this very controversial verse in the book of Leviticus that many people assume they understand on the surface of it, but in fact, it requires more research, more investigation, and especially needs to be understood within the context of Leviticus chapter 18. We need to have serious conversations about all of the verses of the Torah, especially those that are controversial, like this one. So I look forward to any comments that people might have. I welcome them. I welcome the ongoing conversation. Again, I believe that all of us are created in the image of God, and whatever conversations we have should be held with that in mind, that all of us are created in God's image. Everyone, thank you for listening, and Shabbat Shalom.